Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Dr. Elizabeth Cantu. I have the pleasure and privilege of being the current Center for Teaching and Learning Faculty Director at Estrella Mountain Community College. One of the things that we really are striving to do is to continue to figure out how we can better bring conversations with community partners of the experiences and also the resources that are available within our community so that we can better support all of our students. I'm very glad to share that Aliento is a nonprofit that I had the pleasure of seeing grow and just change and evolve and make amazing impact in our community. And the founder, Reina Montoya, was actually here last Women's History Month. She was one of our keynote speakers. And as we continue the conversation of what we can do to better support students with mixed status, undocumented, or DACA status, she let me know that they have this great opportunity, this program where we can learn a little bit more about how Proposition 308 specifically impacts our students. And so very excited to have Pedro with us, and I'll have him introduce himself and start today's presentation. Thank you everyone for being here.
Yeah, so good morning, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. So thank you, Liz, for the introduction. As mentioned, my name is Pedro Gonzalez Faboite. I am the education manager currently at Aliento, which is actually a relatively new role within the organization. I'll talk a little bit more about how that came to be. But yeah, I mean, Aliento, I'll talk about the organization a little bit more in depth as well. But we're a 501(c)(3) nonprofit organization that works here in Arizona. We've done work locally, but also been recognized nationally as well. And we work mainly with undocumented and mixed immigration status families, as well as the overall Hispanic Latino population in Arizona. And then, so, yeah, I mean, just a little bit more about myself. So like I mentioned, I'm the education manager currently at Aliento. I've been with Aliento for roughly just over 2 years now. I originally started with Aliento as an intern during the campaign for Proposition 308. A couple of years ago. So that's really when I started to get involved with Aliento. I'm a DACA recipient myself, so I'm originally born in Sinaloa, Mexico, and I was brought to the US when I was 2 years old and pretty much lived my entire life here in Phoenix, Arizona up until I went to college. I went to predominantly Black and brown middle school, and then I actually got the opportunity to go to Brophy. So I was at Brophy College Prep for high school. And then I graduated in 2018. So 2018 was the year where DACA recipients weren't allowed to receive institution here in Arizona. So it was kind of difficult for me to find a way into higher ed. But fortunately, I had a couple of friends and I knew some people who recommended me to St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas, just because they help a lot financially for students who might be undocumented or DACA. So I went to San Antonio to study. I studied psychology there, and I did a lot of research on education, specifically working with HSIs and ROI and different kinds of things. And then I decided to come back to Arizona. I wasn't really a big fan of San Antonio or Texas, to be honest. It was very different, so I decided to come back. And I had known about Aliento for a while, so I decided to get more involved with Aliento at that time. But more recently, we've been working on the implementation of Proposition 308, so working with you all, working with different high schools and different districts across Arizona, across the valley, to be able to just share the opportunities and resources that there are for students, specifically our undocumented students. Just because I'll talk a little bit more about the data as well, but there's a growing population of immigrants coming in from Mexico, but also all around the world. So it's a very diverse migrant population that we see nowadays. But Aliento, to talk a little bit more about Aliento, our vision at Aliento is a place where human potential was nurtured and not defined by immigration status. So this picture here, actually, that's pictured, is from one of our education days. We hold an education day every year, usually January, February of the year, which is when we go to the state capitol and talk to legislators about issues that are affecting our community. And the biggest, I guess, why we're so proud of this event is because we invite students to be a part of this event. Students are usually the ones that are having these conversations with our state representatives. And it's a really big opportunity for them to be able to advocate for themselves and also for the community. So we're really glad that we have students come out. I think last year we had roughly just shy of 300 students come out and support in all over Arizona. So it's one of our biggest events of the year. But as for our mission, so Aliento serves undocumented DACA and mixed immigration status families to transform trauma into hope and action. We are youth-led and directly impacted people and allies who are invested in the well-being, emotional healing, and leadership development of those impacted by the inequities of lacking in immigration status. The way we do that is by way of our 3 departments, which are listed there. So we have our Cultiva, Nurture, and Transform departments. Each of them sort of handle a different branch of those highlighted portions at the top. So I'll talk a little bit more in depth about each of them. First, we'll start off with the Cultiva department. So Cultiva is what houses our arts and healings programming and initiatives. So what that means is this is sort of like an intersection between mental health and the arts, and it's one aspect of what we do at Aliento. So we do workshops with high schools. Those workshops entail just being able to do certain art projects or just mix in art in any medium that we can think of to be able to talk about and be able to help students express themselves a bit easier, because we know specifically within the community that we work with, sometimes it's a little bit hard to have those kind of conversations. So we like to provide spaces where students feel comfortable sharing, and then also bringing that kind of experience back home to their families. So we also do professional development sessions with practitioners and have any community resources are available if needed by the students. But we also have virtual support groups that are on a demand basis. So if we have enough students who might be interested in having support groups, virtual support groups, we can definitely have those. And then, yeah, we do have a fellowship that's sort of similar to the workshops that we have with high schools, where we come in and we do art projects with them. The cool thing about that is we have an art gallery at the end of the year, so we get to see all the students' art, which is really cool. Our nurture program, this houses our fellowship. So we have a fellowship that's designed for students, specifically high school and college students. And what that entails is a lot of leadership development, supports students' advocacy, resilience, and agency at schools, and supports them with post-secondary pathways. And we really want those students involved in our fellowship to be able to advocate for themselves, and like I mentioned earlier, advocate for themselves, but also for their communities. So they hold events at their schools, relevant events that they really important for their communities. This also houses our internship program. So we have internships available for students, high school and college students as well. And those can vary depending on what's needed at the time. But a really cool thing about Aliento is that we also have different clubs or hubs, as we call them, and different high schools and colleges and universities. And this is basically just like a club version of Aliento at different schools. So we have a big partnership with Mesa High School that houses one of our Aliento clubs there. And they get more involved in many of the projects that are being worked on in the organization. We also have them in other high schools and partnerships with GCU, for example, and ASU also have clubs that do a lot of the same similar work as we do. And then feel free to ask any questions throughout if anything comes up. I'm glad to answer. And then finally, our Transform department that houses our professional development and advocacy. So I like to think of Transform as 2 different sides, just because there's a lot that goes into the work that's done in this program. One is the services aspect, and one is more policy and advocacy. So on the policy and advocacy side, it's a lot of what preparing for that education day, as I mentioned earlier, when we talked to legislators, but also just keeping up with any trends or everything that's impacting our community throughout the year, every month, but also just having those conversations with other stakeholders to be able to be on the same page or see what's going on within our community. And as for the services side, that's sort of where I come in, and the work that I do comes in. So currently, the services we offer professional development opportunities for teachers and for counselors. We also do presentations for students as well, to be able to share the resources that are available, specifically, like I mentioned before, undocumented and mixed immigration status students. And we also just have general information in case anybody that's part of our community that may be undocumented or maybe not, but maybe has a family member that has any questions regarding attorneys or housing, things like that. We definitely can find a way to help them out. We also do DACA renewals. So we do DACA renewals free of charge. If you do know anybody that might be has DACA or ever come across somebody that has DACA, we have to renew every 2 years and it can get pretty costly. The renewals cost $500 every 2 years. So yeah, and then that's just submitting the application, like paying for an attorney or somebody, a third party to help you out with the application is something else, but we do not charge. So yeah, it's a really big help. But we'd like to have a lot of those community resources for families and students as well. So those are 3 programs. I know I went through them relatively quickly, but yeah, I mean, we do a lot of different kinds of things at Aliento. So, I mean, before we go on, I think it's great to be able to just build common language in terms of the terminology and what kind of words are being used or are used specifically within the immigrant community, just to understand who falls under what category, because sometimes it can get a little bit muddy and confusing as to who is classified under which term. So I think it's great to go over these terms. So we'll go over some of the more common terms. So like DREAM, for example, this is any undocumented youth who qualify for the DREAM Act. We know the DREAM Act was something that was proposed a long time ago. So it's not necessarily, I try to stray away from this term just because I see it more of an umbrella term that encompasses everything else, just because there's a lot of different kinds of immigrant individuals who can fall under the category. So it can get a little bit tricky when you use that term. But when you have DACA, so DACA recipients or DACA mented, as sometimes they're called, are undocumented youth who applied for DACA and now have permanent residence instead of being undocumented. So that would be me. So I would be a DACA recipient. And DACA, for those of you who may or may not know, DACA is a program that grants you a social security number and a work permit. So I'm allowed to work legally in the US, and I'm also able to like take out a driver's license, for example, an ID. And I also have, I am deferred from getting deported, so I can get deported. So those are the 3 main things that DACA offers. It's not necessarily a legal status. It just pretty much defers me from deportation and grants me the ability to work. And then undocumented individuals are those who are just lacking any lawful immigration status. And then anyone who might be DACA eligible. So because the DACA program has been closed for a little while now, it is now only open for those who have for renewals. So it's not open for first-time applicants. It's only open for renewals. So there are a lot of students right now that I have worked with personally, that Aliento has been working with, that maybe when they were younger didn't reach the certain requirements of DACA, but now that they do, they are able to apply for it because the program is closed. So those students who maybe could apply for DACA if it was open are DACA eligible individuals. So those are just undocumented individuals who maybe could qualify for DACA, but because it's closed, they can't apply. And then just mixed status families. So those are families in which members may vary in immigration status. I like to use myself as an example for this one, just because I'm a DACA recipient. My parents are undocumented and my younger siblings are US citizens. So that combination, any combination really of any of those would classify as a mixed status family. And then any eligible non-citizen, as I'm sure you're aware, is someone who qualifies for federal student aid specifically, but is not necessarily a citizen of the United States. So US nationals, residents, refugees, asylum granted individuals, things like that. Does anybody have any questions on the terminology before I go ahead? Cool. So yeah, I mean, diving into a little bit more specific about Arizona and the undocumented population, and then getting later on more in depth into the education and how we can help maybe those undocumented students continue their education. So currently, Arizona's total population is just under 7.4 million, with roughly 200,000 children, 200,000 plus children living with at least one unauthorized family member. So that's those are undocumented individuals. And then if we go down to the last bullet point there, 11% of Arizona students K through 12 live in a mixed status family. Most of them are US citizens. So This means that the students maybe are US citizens, but they might have likely parents who are undocumented. The first thing that I think of here is just FAFSA. I know we had a big issue with FAFSA this past year, specifically with those students who might be citizens, but might have those undocumented parents. I'll talk a little bit more about it in a little bit as well, but we were doing a lot of work this past year that we weren't intending to do, specifically working around FAFSA, just because we wanted to support those students who were part of mixed immigration status families and couldn't submit the FAFSA. And then more specific to our undocumented and DACA population. So 10% of our undocumented students in school are eligible for DACA, and that can actually be closer now to 5%, closer and closer to 0, just because, like I mentioned earlier, the DACA program is closed, which means that the students that are going to be graduating high school, for the most part from here on out, if the DACA program either ends or stays as is, are not going to be eligible for it, which means they're going to be strictly undocumented going into or graduating high school and then potentially going into higher education. So they won't be having that work permit. They won't be having the social security number that DACA permits need to have. So a lot of the students that are going to be graduating are going to be strictly undocumented, which is an additional barrier when trying to access, just graduating and then living their lives, but also just accessing higher education as a whole. So like as mentioned in the last bullet point there, DACA is antiquated for certain high school students since it's closed. So a lot of the students will not be DACA eligible. So I know sometimes it's very difficult, and that's why I wanted to go over the terminology as well, because sometimes it can be a little confusing as to who is DACA and who is undocumented, or if they're the same thing, or what the difference is. But yeah, the difference is that DACA recipients are allowed that work permit and social security number, which means they can get IDs, things like that. But our undocumented students do not have that ability. So whenever they graduate from high school, for example, or even currently, they might not have any state identification, things like that, which may be a little bit difficult when they're trying to apply to higher education, or like I mentioned earlier, just try to find a job if they can. Going into more specific about the work that I've been doing over the past year. So beginning of the year, this year, we were able to get some funding from the governor's office to work a little bit more directly on the implementation of Proposition 308. So I had a team, and we were designated with reaching as many people as we could, honestly. And that included those direct beneficiaries, so any students that might be documented themselves and be eligible for DACA, or sorry, not DACA, for Proposition 308. And also just working with different high schools and districts, specifically with practitioners like teachers, counselors, advisors, pretty much anyone who was in that direct contact with the student, and having those conversations of, are you going to go to college? Like, have you done your applications? So we have been trying to talk to as many as we can over the past year, to be able to share this information, just because it's still relatively new, right? It's been 2 years, but there's not really a comprehensive sort of implementation process happening currently in Arizona for in-state tuition for undocumented individuals. So we really wanted to make sure that we hit as many students and as many practitioners as we could to be able to share out this information, because the last thing we want is for a student to maybe just not know that this is an opportunity that's available to them. And that's a lot of what we have seen and still continue to see, like throughout the different presentations and things that we do as part of this program, just because there's a lot of schools, there's a lot of students, and there's a lot of information to get to them, and they're already getting a lot of information. So one of the biggest things when we share these presentations with the students is, wow, I didn't know this was even a thing. Like, I didn't know this was an opportunity. So we want to make sure that just that spark of it being an opportunity is instilled in the students, because it can really go a long way. But yeah, like I mentioned, we were trying to reach those direct beneficiaries, practitioners, institutional leaders. So this is a lot of individuals that are leaders in their schools, in their communities, to be able to same thing, just be able to do the similar outreach and be able to share these opportunities and resources with their students, with their staff, and then also just the general public. So being able to work with different news outlets, media outlets, radio, to be able to share on a more broad scale the opportunities and resources that come with being able to get in-state tuition in Arizona now. And these are just some numbers that currently, so this actually, this initiative ended at end of last month. So I had a team of 3 coordinators alongside myself working on this. Sadly, it is just now back to me, but we plan on getting some more help and other coordinators to be able to help me share and spread the word. But over the past 6-7 months, I believe we reached over 3,000 students, over 1,000 practitioners, over 100 institutional leaders, and nearly 3 million community members, and that's by way of workshops with the students and practitioners, with institutional leaders, and then by different media outlets for the community members. And this is just a little map of the map on the left has to be updated. We've done a lot more ever since I last updated this one, but we've been doing work with a bunch of different school districts: Mesa, Phoenix Union, Glendale, working with Leona Group schools, Tolleson, Tucson. We've been trying to reach as many people as we can all over the valley. And I mean, we're still doing it now. It's work that I think is going to continue on for a little while. And which is, like I said, the biggest thing we want to do is just be able to share that these are resources and it's an opportunity for students that's now available to them. But now, speaking of all this, I know Prop308 was the big question that we wanted to talk, and then these are just some pictures of the work that we've been doing, but getting more into specifics about the proposition itself. So Proposition 308 was passed in 2022. And I know this is something that we have been sort of going back and forth on at Aliento, but Prop 308 allows for all Arizona high school graduates to be eligible for in-state tuition and state-funded scholarships when a student attains a public or private high school or homeschool equivalent in Arizona for at least 2 years. So they're in school for 2 years here in Arizona, and then they graduate from that public, private, or homeschool in Arizona, or obtain a GED in Arizona. So those are the 2 big requirements. So it's studying in Arizona, being a student in Arizona for at least 2 years, and then graduating from said school or obtaining a GED equivalence. It can get a little bit tricky as to the GED portion specifically, just because it's a matter of being able to work with the student and seeing if they have sufficient evidence of their 2 years, and it gets a little bit more tricky and complicated. But I think one of the biggest reasons why it was sort of written this way is just to be able to increase the number of students that might be eligible, because overall we really wanted to make sure that students were sort of not pushed away from this idea. And we also know that, I mean, students now, there's sort of like there's 2 sides to at least from my perspective, when what I've seen from going into schools, is that there's students who have been here all 4 years, for example, maybe in a school, they're going to school, they're graduating. So that would be pretty clear cut and dry, eligible for in-state tuition. But then you might have students who maybe are recent arrivals who were here their junior and senior year only of high school. So then maybe they do qualify for those 2 years, but then it gets a little bit more tricky. So I actually did want to go over, so I have a few cases that we can talk about together, but these are just some frequently asked questions. I have a couple here. So, and these are just from conversations that we've had from these workshops that we've been going to throughout the past year. It's just the more common questions that we've had from practitioners, and also even from students themselves. What are Prop 308 students eligible for federal financial aid, so FAFSA? And no, so undocumented, they're still undocumented, so they aren't eligible for those federal financial aid programs, but they might be eligible for other state scholarships or grants besides the Arizona Promise, because the Arizona Promise is currently only for US citizens as well. And then the second frequently asked question that we get is visas. So are students with visas eligible for in-state tuition? The answer for this is also no. And one of the biggest reasons why this was included in the text also was because the way it's worded, you have to be undocumented to be able to be eligible for in-state tuition, which sort of is contradicting if you have a visa. because you have some sort of status in the United States. So any students with a visa are not eligible for in-state tuition. This can maybe, for example, if a student has a visa and they want to study, let me backtrack. So the biggest reason why this was ran this way is because we didn't want students with a visa to be able to need to strip away their visa status in order to be eligible for Proposition 308. So we'd rather the student keep their visa status than to get that stripped away and be eligible for in-state tuition. With that said, if a student, for example, has an overstayed visa, at that point they become undocumented, which then they would be eligible for in-state tuition. Does that make sense? I know that's I know that's one of the big questions that we've also been getting recently is just the difficulty in understanding these visa cases, and also just understanding what kind of student is eligible for in-state tuition and which is not. But like I mentioned earlier, the most common student case, so Maria migrated to the country. This is just, I have a couple of these so we can go over them together. And these are all actually real. So we've worked with students who, obviously names are changed for privacy reasons. We work with these students because these are real situations that we found. And we just want to make sure that they're shared with you all just because there might be students who you may come across in the future, if not already. But Maria migrated to the country when she was 6 years old. She has attended K-12 in Arizona. She is currently a high school senior on track to graduate. She plans to attend her local Maricopa Community College in the fall after graduating. She is DACA eligible, however, the DACA program is closed. So Maria currently holds no immigration legal status, which means she is undocumented. So if she applies in the fall, after graduating, would she be eligible for in-state tuition? Yes, no, maybe so. So, yes, I see a couple nods here in person. So yes, she would be eligible. Like I mentioned earlier, this is pretty much clear cut and dry that she would be eligible for in-state tuition. She's been here all 4 years. She's been here K-12, and she is eventually going to graduate. So she would be eligible for in-state tuition. When it gets a little bit more tricky is in cases like this, like Alex, where he has a visa status. Let me check the chats.
Pedro, there is a question that came up in the chat, maybe before you get into this specific unique case.
Yep.
So you had often talked a lot about student advocacy and just kind of how you all have been able to build more capacity within schools and also students just in kind of understanding resources and services that are available to them. But maybe what are some recommendations that you would have for us as a college as to what's the best way to share with students the resources and services that are actually available for them and their families?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the biggest, and that's one of the many reasons why I'm here today is just to be able to know that we are a resource in case, because I've had conversations with practitioners when we go to do these kind of workshops and they're like, hey, like I might have the student or like I used to have the student that maybe needed some more additional help and I just didn't know where to go with any resources because I just wasn't sure to that. So honestly, it would just be either going to us, like telling them, hey, Aliento, just go to the website and they can try to help you out. I can drop my contact later on. I'll have my contact later on in the presentation itself, but just having Aliento as a resource as in general for whenever any of those questions come up. But I think on a more individual level, it can, and I'll have some things later on as well, but it's just being able to stay informed. I know we always try to keep our community informed, whether it be through social media, whether it be through our like mailing lists or our website. So I think one of the biggest ways is just to share and just to continue constantly being informed. We're always posting on our social media with any updates that regarding our community, but also just like I mentioned, just having us as a resource. I think that's one of the reasons why I came today is just so that you're all aware and know that we are a resource here to help not only you, but also your students in case you have any questions that maybe they can't answer. But yeah, I mean, just being able to have that kind of opportunity to be here today and just, I mean, you all being here today also just shows that you are interested and invested in your well-being of the students. So yeah, those are just some of the ways that I can think of off the top of my head right now.
Thank you so much.
But yeah, so thank you so much for that question. And then getting back to some more of the unique cases. So this is a visa question. So Alex migrated to the country as a child with a tourist visa, a B2 and an I-94 from Mexico in 2012. He has lived in Arizona and attended school since elementary. He is now a senior in high school. And he went back to Mexico to renew his I-94 before it expired. And he is currently back in Arizona and has a valid I-94. Does everyone know what an I-94 is? I can also explain that real quick. Yeah. So when you have a visa, so you get these two documentations. So one is the type of visa, which in this case would be a tourist visa, a B2. And on the other hand, you have an I-94. The I-94 is what tells you how long you're allowed to stay in the United States. Just for simplicity's sake, we have, let's say Alex has a tourist visa, a B2, and his I-94 is for a year. So before that year is up, he has to go back to Mexico to renew it for another year. Does that make sense? So the B2, the classification is a different thing. The I-94 is the biggest thing that needs to be taken into account because that states how long this individual is allowed to be in the United States. So as mentioned in that paragraph there, Alex went back to renew his I-94, so it's currently active, which means he doesn't have an expired visa, he didn't overstay his visa, so he currently still holds a valid visa. So is he eligible for 308 once he graduates high school? No, he still has a visa, right? Correct. So yeah, he would not be eligible because he still has the active I-94, and like as mentioned earlier, he didn't overstay his visa, it's still active. But if for whatever reason he didn't have that active I-94, he would accrue that unlawful immigration status, which means he would become documented. So like I mentioned, it gets a little bit more tricky because then he doesn't have a visa, and then we have to figure out all the specifics. But I think in situations like this, I think it's great to be able to either contact us or just refer back to this presentation, for example, just to understand a little bit better of who is eligible and who's not. Because again, like I mentioned, the last thing we want to do is for a student to think that they might be eligible. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But to be told that they're not eligible and then sort of just having this, it's just not, it really is. I've worked with students in the past who have been stuck in situations like this where maybe they thought they were eligible and they ended up not being eligible, or they were eligible and were told they weren't eligible. And it's just very difficult for the student because they come in very, very happy and very excited to be able to go to college or university, and yeah, it's very difficult sometimes for the students. So I think it's just a matter of being able to work with them and us, just to, if they're not eligible, then they're not eligible, just to make sure that they're not eligible 100%. Yes.
And it's just important to note that anytime you hear visa, you really have to explore that, just period, because there's some visas where you're not even allowed to attend college to maintain your visa status, and so you don't want to, cause that person harm in the future by them not being able to have their status. So this is an FYI.
Yeah, and that adds to the point of why we didn't want to include visas in the first place, because we know that sometimes an individual might find themselves in that situation. So we don't want them to jeopardize their visa status in any way or for a chance to get in-state tuition. So yeah, it can get a little bit tricky with visas. So it's always good to double check on visa specifically, on which kind of visa they have, and their I-94s, and that's active, if it's active or not. But yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And yeah, I mean, those were two of the cases that we had. And I think just more on financial assistance specifically for our undocumented students, but also just students as a whole. I know specifically here at the Maricopa Community Colleges, we have the foundation. So we've actually worked closely with the foundation to provide or to create the City of Phoenix Promise program. So I know that's something that I had been working with them. And as part of sort of the the work towards building that City of Phoenix program. We also did it because the City of Phoenix program is for those US citizens and lawful permanent resident students that might be interested in going to a community college, but we've also worked with them to create sort of a similar program that's called the Dreamer Pathways program for specifically undocumented and DACA recipients. So it's pretty much the same thing as the City of Phoenix Promise program, but for those undocumented and DACA recipient students. And that comes from funding, from other funding. I know it's right now, we're sort of like in a tricky situation with that just because of funding. But we have been working with, I think at this point, a little bit over 100 students in the past couple of years to be able to go to community colleges here in Maricopa County. So it's been great working with the foundation, and I know they also have a lot of work, a lot of scholarship opportunities and a lot of financial aid opportunities. Specifically, I know the foundation. I've been talking with them just to be able to see what kind of opportunities they have, specifically financial aid wise for undocumented and DACA recipient students, and they definitely have them. So making sure to always reach out to students if you may know that they are undocumented. I know that sometimes you don't, but just sharing these kinds of resources with them can really go a long way, specifically for the students. And then also just the portal in general, I'm sure you all are very aware, but they have a lot more help there as well to be able to get some more of that financial aid. And I think, and something that we have been working on also with the universities, is using the CSS profile, which is, it's not used commonly. It's mainly used for your private institutions or like out of state, for example. But it's just another way to measure income and how much financial assistance can be provided to you. So we have been talking with the 3 state universities. So if for whatever reason, after the students complete their time here at the community colleges and they want to go on to one of the 3 state universities here in Arizona, they are now using the CSS profile as an option for those students who aren't eligible for FAFSA, which includes our Prop308 students. So this is a need-based financial aid application for the 3 state universities. And the reason why we wanted to include that application is free for those students whose family income is less than 100,000, because we know that maybe students that are coming from the Prop308 population or are undocumented and DACA recipient students aren't necessarily going to be making that much. But we do know that, like, I know for me, for example, when I was studying, those $30, $40, up to $60 that an application cost can fairly well be used for gas money or for lunch to go to school. So we really wanted to make sure that it was something that's accessible to them. But like I said, the CSS profile is an option for those students who maybe after community college want to go on to any of those other institutions. It's just another resource for them and another way to maybe get some extra financial assistance and then be eligible for any of those other either merit-based scholarships or university-funded scholarships that any of the 3 universities provide. This is just how to complete it. So I won't go into too much depth here, but it's a very simple application. I did a run through with it when we were testing it out initially with the 3 universities, just to make sure there weren't nothing was confusing, or if there was, we talked about it and we made sure that it was accessible again, like I mentioned, for our Prop308 eligible students. And then this is just a QR code that has Aliento scholarships on them. Some of them are directly funded by us, but some are just a list of scholarships that we find for students who might be interested in getting that additional funding or financial assistance. So we definitely do have that if you want to take a look. And this is all housed in our website. Our website's down at the bottom right, alientoaz.org, and we have all the information that we talked about here today, and also the scholarship information for any students that might be interested, or for any of you that might be interested in sharing with your students, to be able to share a little bit more of the financial assistance that's available to them. And I wanted to include this last bit here on undocumented students get a job after college, just because, again, this is one of the biggest questions that we get whenever we do these kinds of workshops, is specifically with our high school counselors and advisors, because when we have these conversations with them, they're like, yes, like I'm all for it, but sometimes the student comes to me and is like, yes, I can go to school and I can go to college, but what am I to do with that afterwards, because I'm undocumented, so I can't necessarily work. which is a very tough conversation to have, specifically because here in Arizona, it's very difficult for them to find a way to work specifically with whatever degree they graduate with, and especially more of like those STEM degrees. So here in Arizona, occupational and professional licensure requires applicants to possess lawful immigration status. So DACA recipients who have that work permit and that social security number may be eligible for those licensures once they graduate high school, college, if they graduate with a degree. But those who might be strictly undocumented might have a more difficult time because they aren't allowed to get that professional or occupational licensure. So as of right now in Arizona, those students who do not have DACA and are strictly undocumented and have that degree cannot practice in their area of study because they cannot get licensed in it. So we as Aliento have been doing some work to try to maybe work on that at the state level, but it's still a work in progress. But it's like I mentioned, it's always a difficult conversation because it's either because we try to provide them with very real, maybe not solutions, but workarounds. And one of those maybe can include like, yes, you can graduate with your degree. You maybe can't study here, but maybe you can study elsewhere, practice elsewhere. So, and that's a very difficult and hard decision to make, just because it's a very personal answer. So, but yeah, we try to provide them with very real situations that can maybe be helpful, but it's also very difficult sometimes to work with these kind of situations just because it can let down students, but we're trying to work on it. So we're trying everything we can to be able to work on it. But as of now, DACA recipients are eligible for being able to practice in the area of study, but undocumented individuals cannot in the state of Arizona. So we're taking it one step at a time. We're trying to get there. The one thing I do recommend though, for those that might be undocumented is getting an LLC. So this is where you can work as a contractor, for example, and have some sort of income. These are just the steps. And I'm sure I'll be sure to share this with Liz also, so you can have this just in case it's ever needed. But yeah, definitely recommend getting an LLC for students who might be undocumented. You can skip this slide. And then just more on supporting students and families, as mentioned earlier. I know we talked about it a little bit with the question in the chat. But it's very difficult sometimes for students. They have that burden of being a student and an educator simultaneously during the process in applying higher education. A lot of the students that might be undocumented are probably going to be first generation students, so they don't necessarily have that knowledge on how to apply for college, where to look for scholarships, who to go for if they have any questions. So it can be very difficult sometimes for students to just honestly be a senior in high school as an undocumented individual when you have so much going on. So just being able to co-learn with them, understanding and keeping up with, like I mentioned earlier, with immigration policy and the impact that it has, and just communicating with the students in terms of supporting them, just listening to them and allowing for safe spaces, motivation and encouragement, which can be difficult at times, but it can definitely go a long way from the perspective of the student. And just being able to provide scholarships. And if you can't provide the scholarships or the resources themselves, just you have us now as a resource. So just me being able to, like I mentioned, this is one of the biggest reasons why I wanted you to come today, is to have us be a resource. So whenever you are encountering a situation like this with a student and you don't necessarily have the answers, that's okay, because you know that Aliento can be a resource that you can share with them. And just making connections, just having conversations with them, finding that middle ground can really support. And then just connecting and providing support groups. It's very difficult to work through all of this alone. So I think even just having individuals who maybe have gone through the process beforehand, and sort of have a little bit more of an understanding of how to go through it and how to support students, it can really help out the student and go a long way. And then there's just more best practices on how to create those safe spaces. So just having welcoming posters, signs, etc., in your classrooms or in your space. We do have some posters. I forgot to bring them today, so I owe you all some posters. But just being able to just set up that welcoming space and building that trust and confidentiality, and just knowing that sometimes it's not something that you do or don't do. It's just it's very difficult and complex to be able to open up about your immigration status. So sometimes it'll just be difficult just because for whatever reason, maybe past experiences, maybe just rhetoric, they're maybe having a more difficult time opening up about these situations, but just being there for your students and building that confidentiality always works. And can go a long way, like I mentioned. And these are just some more resources. Like I said, these are all active links, so I'll make sure to share this with Liz so you all have these. And then this is something that we have also on our website. This was actually created. It's a guide created by one of the students. She actually just graduated from GCU. Her name is Daniela Chavira. She is an undocumented student, and she created this guide with the hopes of being used by both students and practitioners just to understand the process of applying to college as an undocumented student. So it's pretty much a one-on-one on how to do it. It includes everything from applying to college applications, scholarships, and then also just understanding more of those kinds of tests that you need, application process, how financial aid works, things like that. So it's a really good resource to have. And that can be found on our website as well. But with that, I mean, that concludes presentation section. I did want to leave a few minutes afterwards just for any questions or any other feedback from you all. Because I know it was a lot of information, so I want to make sure we're all on the same page. And this is my contact information. Please feel free to write that down and feel free to shoot me an email whenever you can or would like or have any questions, and I'll be sure to respond and help you out. And then also on the bottom right, like I mentioned earlier, we have our website at alientoaz.org and also our social media. Because we post a lot specifically on Instagram, just with anything and everything, updates on immigration policy, just overall, really anything and everything we post on social media. So that's one way to definitely stay updated with us. Or you could just go on our website and sign up for our mailing list as well. But yes, that's all from me. Thank you all so much for listening and for being here. And yeah, like I mentioned, we're gonna have a little bit of time for questions. So if you do have any questions, feel free to let me know. I'm not sure, Liz, are there any questions in the chats?
Well, you got a shout out just saying thank you so much for the presentation and your work in this field. Maybe I have a question. You know, we know how important clubs and organizations can be to help create sense of belonging for our students, and also just, you know, build community. I think that's one of the things that I have always been inspired by students at ASU when I worked at ASU who really worked together to not only find each other, but then obviously mobilize and be in a way advocates for themselves and their communities, right? And that's where we see all the amazing things that Aliento and other organizations have been able to do for so much of our undocumented DACA mixed status family communities. You had mentioned that there's hubs, right, that we could potentially look to activate within our campuses. Can you tell us a little bit more about what a hub is like for students and like how the institution could support if a student group wanted to maybe start a hub here?
Yeah, so I mean, the hubs function very similarly to just any other club that you were to create on campus. So you have the students, you have the advisor or whatever the title is, that staff advisor that's part of the club as well. But they function in a way, so a lot of the times the students that are part of the hubs might have a student that is also involved by way of our fellowship program. So they're very intertwined. And if not, then the way we work with the hubs as Aliento, as the organization, is within that nurture department, we have two leadership development coordinators. And they work with the clubs to be able to share the resources that we have at Aliento, and then also work with that club, whether it be with the president or VP or whatever, whatever members want to be integrated in that direct communication, to be able to either let them or provide resources so that they can then share with their own communities. So if we're using Estrella Mountain as an example, let's say we have a club here and I am the student leader of that club. and I talked to the leadership development coordinator at Aliento. We have regular meetings just to be able to keep up and sort of develop that leadership ability. And it's sort of like a mentor. It's sort of like a mentor relationship with the Aliento staff. And on the club side, it's being able to advocate for the community. So whatever I'm not necessarily entirely sure of the population of Estrella Marin, but let's say, for example, the students that are part of the club are really, really invested in wanting, I don't know, let's say, on informing the community about the dangers, or not dangers, but the benefits of individuals who are undocumented having a driver's license. So let's say the students are very invested in that. Aliento is sort of just helping them find ways to be able to do that outreach and communicate that with the rest of their community. So it's very much student-led in terms of like, what do you want to focus on and what's driving the club to exist. And Aliento can help you facilitate that drive and that motivation and share and advocate for your community. Yeah.
And I'll just add, so in terms of setting up a club that isn't in existence, students would work with Herschel in the student life office to go through that process. And an established club also has some expectations to maintain their club operation. And so there are some guidelines and unfortunately some constraints to some things, but that setting up the club and getting a club going, and Herschel's team is phenomenal at guiding students that have the interest and getting that established. It goes through the process. And there's the involvement of the club advisor. We do call club advisors.
Yeah.
And so those would be some of the expectations of a club operating under the EMCC.
Yeah, I know a lot of the high schools specifically that we work with, or I mean, one of them I know, when I was at Brophy, we had an advocacy club, and it wasn't necessarily tied to Aliento, but Aliento was definitely a partner in events and in just being able to get the word out. So it could be a similar situation here. Yeah. Any other questions?
Well, Pedro, we thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to learn a little bit more about Proposition 308 and also the amazing work that Aliento does within our community. There's definitely a lot of resources that we will keep, and hopefully we'll have you back, or maybe we'll even reach out to you all should any questions or situations come up that we can learn from you and how we can better serve our students and their families. So with that, thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. It has been a pleasure to have Pedro on our campus, and then thank you all so much for sharing some of your time. And I will be sure to share a copy of the slides, and we'll hopefully continue the conversation. Have a good one, everyone.